This is Cast of Wonders, the young adult fiction podcast featuring stories of the fantastic. Welcome. Episode 544. I'm Denise Sudell, Community Manager and Associate Editor for Cast of Wonders, and I have the great pleasure of bringing you part one of our latest story, 9 Goblins by T. Kingfisher. T. Kingfisher, more usually known as Ursula Vernon, is the author of many children's books, the Hugo Award-winning comic Digger, and the Nebula Award-winning story Jackalope Wives. She writes books for adults and young adults under the name T. Kingfisher, including The Seventh Bride, The Raven and the Reindeer, and the latest, A House with Good Bones. In 2021, she won the Lodestar Award for Best Young Adult Book for the novel A Wizard's Guide to Defensive Baking. This story is narrated by Catherine Inskip, who is also the editor for Cast of Wonders. She teaches astrophysics for a living and spends her spare time populating the universe with worlds of her own. You can find more of her stories and poems at Motherboard, The Dunes Thief, Luna Station Quarterly, Abyss and Apex, and Polutechni. And now, we've a tale to tell.
Nine Goblins by T. Kingfisher. Narrated by Catherine Inskip. Part 1. It was gruel again for breakfast. It had been gruel for dinner the night before, and it would be gruel sandwiches for lunch, a dish only possible with goblin gruel, which was burnt solid and could be trusted not to ooze off the bread. It usually had unidentifiable lumps of something in it. Sometimes the lumps had legs. Once, Corporal Algol had found an eyeball in his gruel, the memory of which he carried with him like a good luck charm and inflicted regularly on his fellow soldiers. Did I ever tell you guys about the time I found an eyeball? Yes. Oh. Algol wasn't a bad sort, really. He was bigger than usual for a goblin, a whopping 4'10", with broad, knotty shoulders and enormous feet. He had the ochre-grey skin of a hill goblin, and he wasn't all that bright. But then he was a goblin officer. Smart goblins became mechanics. Dumb goblins became soldiers. Really dumb goblins became officers. One of the latter was gesturing grandly from the top of a nearby rise. Nobody in the 19th Infantry, better known as the Whining Niners, could hear what he was saying, but this was probably a good thing. If you couldn't hear what the officers said, you couldn't be said to be disobeying orders. It was amazing how selectively deaf goblin soldiers could be, particularly when words like charge and advance and get your finger out of there, soldier, were involved. What do you think he's on about? Asked Weatherby, jerking his thumb in the direction of the officer. Everybody turned and looked, since there was nothing else to do. They had been sitting in the middle of a stony wasteland for a week, and it was either watch the officers or watch the bird. There was only one bird, and it had been hanging around waiting for something to die for most of that week. The officer was waving his arms wildly now and hopping on one foot, like a man being attacked by ants. His red coat flapped in the breeze like shabby scarlet wings. "We're going to move out," said Murray. "You think?" Murray nodded. "He's making a big speech. He only does that when he thinks we might get into a scrape with the enemy. The enemy's not going to come at us here, so we must be moving out." For a goblin, Murray was a genius. He'd washed out of the Mechanics Corps for being too good at his job. Goblins appreciate machines that are big and clunky and have lots of spiky bits sticking off them and which break down and explode and take half the core with them. That's how you knew it worked. If it couldn't kill goblins, how could you trust it to kill the enemy? Murray made small, neat, efficient devices that didn't even maim anybody during the construction phases. Nobody believed for a minute that the things would work, and Murray was sent down to the infantry in disgrace. When his designs later proved dramatically successful, leaving enormous craters in the enemy ranks and, on one notable occasion, causing an entire platoon of elves to simultaneously wet themselves on the field of battle, nobody could remember who'd built them. There was such a rapid turnover in the Mechanics Corps that the people who'd thrown him out were now mostly scattered in bits across the landscape, or had transferred back to Goblin Home to teach. Murray was, therefore, the exception to the whining 19th, and indeed to most of the surviving Goblin infantry. Too dumb to desert, too smart to die. Even this was more clever than accurate. There are situations where no amount of smarts keeps you from getting killed. Blockhammer had been sitting down at breakfast a week ago, as canny a goblin veteran as you could wish for, and one of the supply rocks had gotten sweaty claws. The giant bird had been passing directly overhead, and the elephant it was carrying popped right out of its talons and landed directly on Blockhammer's head. Also on his body, his camp stool, and all the space in a 15-foot radius around him. When they went to bury him, they couldn't figure out which bits were Blockhammer and which bits were the elephant. So the 19th had buried his sword instead. They rolled a stone over it, and Murray wrote R.I.P. Blockhammer on it. His genius did not extend to spelling, and Nasilka had sung a goblin lament. Everyone was very moved and toasted Blockhammer's memory repeatedly over the next batch of elephant gruel. It was possible the gruel also contained bits of Blockhammer. Nobody wanted to dwell on this. The other half of the saying wasn't too accurate either. Weatherby, for example, had deserted no less than 15 times, and he was so dumb it was remarkable he hadn't been tapped as officer material. It was really pretty easy to desert. People did it all the time, but Weatherby had made an art of it. He would nod to the rest of the 19th as they sat around the campfire and say, "Right, I'm off then," and then walk in a straight line until he hit the edge of the Goblin army encampment. Once he was 50 feet from the edge of camp, Weatherby proceeded to rip off his clothes, run to the nearest hill, rise or tree stump, and begin dancing wildly in the moonlight while shouting, "I'm free, you sods, free! I'm a free goblin! Woohoo! Free!" Eventually the guards would come and get him and bring him home again, although his clothes were usually a loss. Since the Goblin army had blown almost all its uniform budget on red coats for the officers, everybody was wearing loincloths from home anyway, so nobody much noticed. Footnote: except for the 18th Infantry, who were primarily from the lower tunnels of Goblin Home and could not afford loincloths. This was particularly unsettling to the 17th Infantry, who had to march next to them. The 19th also had to march with them, but had largely stopped caring. And anyway, nobody could deny the effect of the sight of the 18th on enemy morale. A runner came up to the edge of the fire where the 19th were sitting. "New orders, Sergeant," he said, saluting Nasilka. Nasilka muttered something under her breath. She was the ranking member of the 19th since Blockhammer had gotten splattered, followed by Murray and Algol, who were corporals, and everybody else who weren't. You could tell the ranks by the stripes on the loincloth, although this system had drawbacks if you were trying to tell the difference between a general and somebody who just didn't do laundry often enough. Nasilka didn't like being in charge. She was good at it, but she didn't like it. She had been the oldest of 6 children and was the veteran of 3 campaigns, and as a result, both responsibility and suspicion of rank were etched in Nasilka's bones. Finding herself as a senior member of the Whining Niners was like a constant itch between her shoulder blades. "What's the word, then?" she asked. "General Globelix says to break camp. We're moving out." He saluted again. He had to be new. Nobody was that enthusiastic after the first month. "Will do," said Nasilka and waited. The runner saluted again. He was a scrawny little green fellow, probably with imp blood somewhere a few generations back. He saluted for the 4th time, hard enough to bruise his forehead. Sergeant Nasilka took pity on him and saluted back, and he ran off to the next camp. Nasilka was a female goblin, which meant that everybody was a little scared of her. Occasionally you saw women in the enemy armies, generally slim, willowy young women with longbows and grim expressions. She wondered if everybody on their side tiptoed around them like naughty children with an unpredictable schoolteacher. Somehow she doubted it. There was nothing slim or willowy about Nasilka. She was built like a chunk of granite, and she could carry a live boar under one arm. The only concession to femininity was that she wore her hair in a bun instead of a long queue, and she wore slightly fewer earrings than everyone else. "All right, maggots, you heard the man," she growled. "Pack up and move out." Most of the Whining 19th groaned and grumbled and sulked. Murray and Algol, however, got to their feet and went to start packing their kits, and eventually the rest followed. Sergeant Nasilka had just shoved her spiked club into her belt when a flash of red indicated that the officer had returned to his position on the cliff. Now he was mounted on his parade pig, a big white porker with its hooves polished and ribbons twined in its tail. He made a sweeping gesture with his sword. The pig squealed. "And that's our cue," Nasilka said. She slung her pack over her shoulder and looked around her unit. They were mostly packed. Murray was helping the 2 newest recruits get their gear arranged. Algol had the lead rope for the supply goat. Gluber had a finger up his nose. "Move out!" The Whining Niners moved out. How the Goblin War, if you ask the humans, or the glorious conflict resisting the ongoing human aggression, if you ask the Goblin generals, or the bloody miserable mess, if you ask the 19th Infantry, got started, really depends on which side was doing the talking. Humans and elves will tell you that goblins are stinking, slinking, filthy, sheep-stealing, cattle-rustling, hen-house-raiding, disgusting, smelly, obnoxious, rude, unmannerly, and violent. The goblins would actually agree with all that, and they might add cowardly and lazy to the list as well. Goblins have lots of flaws, but few illusions. As far as the human side of the war is concerned, one day the goblins, who had been keeping to themselves pretty well in the high hills and deep mires, came out to a human settlement, riding their pigs and waving banners, and holding a list of really laughable demands. The humans refused, and the next day they were hip-deep in short green and ochre people with tusks. The humans retaliated, the goblins retaliated for the retaliation, the elves got involved, the orcs got involved because the elves were involved, and by the end of 6 months, it was a horrible, churning, entrenched mess where troops on both sides sat around for weeks on end and occasionally ran at each other screaming. Again, the goblins would agree with most of that account, but there was more to it than that. Once upon a time, goblins had lived everywhere. Like rabbits, goblins are an immensely adaptable, quick-breeding lot, capable of living under practically any conditions. There are hill goblins and marsh goblins, forest goblins who live in trees, and savanna goblins who live in network tunnels like prairie dog towns. There are desert goblins and jungle goblins, miniature island goblins and heavy-bodied tundra goblins. Goblins live everywhere. Wherever a goblin happens to live, he complains about it constantly. This is actually a sign of affection. A desert goblin will complain endlessly about the beastly heat and the dreadful dryness and the spiky cactus. He will show you how his sunburn is peeling, and the place where the rattlesnake bit him, and the place where he bit the rattlesnake. He will be thoroughly, cheerfully miserable. If you took him away from the desert, he would be lost. He wouldn't know what to complain about. He might make a few half-hearted attempts, but he would eventually lapse into confused silence and return as quickly as possible to the desert he loves. Complaining is how he shows he's paying attention to all the little nuances of his home. This is basically goblin psychology in a nutshell. Goblin cooks wait in anticipation for the rude comments about the flavour. A goblin courting the lady goblin of his dreams will point out the new lumps and splotches on her skin and ask if she's been sick lately because she looks off colour, and hey, is that a tick behind her left ear? Goblins are in many ways stoics. When they're genuinely unhappy, they shut up and put their heads down and just try to blunder through. Goblin divorces are notable for their lack of screaming. If a goblin eats something without complaining, it was so bad he doesn't want to dwell on it. Gruel among the 19th Infantry had recently reached this point, and breakfast had become a silent, glum affair. A goblin trying to make the best of things is a very tragic sight indeed. So the goblins lived over much of the land, and the woods and plains and deserts and whatnot rang with the cheery sounds of goblin complaints. Then the humans came. They came in small groups at first and cleared little clearings and built little houses, and the goblins didn't really mind. They're cowards, after all, and there was plenty of room, so they had no desire to forcibly evict the humans. They just avoided those places. The clearings got bigger, and the houses got bigger, and the goblins kept avoiding them until, one day, there was hardly any place left that you weren't avoiding. And one by one, tribe by tribe, the goblins would melt quietly away into the wilderness to impose on the hospitality of the next tribe over. Sometimes, of course, it wasn't that easy. In a few cases, goblins wound up living on mountaintops and tunnelling down instead of running away. On islands, they would have to steal boats and rafts from the humans and strike out across the ocean. Occasionally, they couldn't find another island without people on it, and a whole colony of raft goblins sprang up, travelling with the currents, living on fish and seabirds and whatever they could steal from human settlements. A knot of goblins even got stuck in a park for years, every avenue of escape having been filled in by a reasonably large city. They survived by panhandling and occasional muggings, and a fair number established themselves successfully in the sewers, where they breed riding rats the size of ponies and wrestle white alligators in the dark. By and large, though, the goblins went deeper and deeper into the wilderness, and the wilderness got smaller and smaller and tamer and tamer. And then one day, a goblin scouting for new territory found himself standing on a beach, gazing out across the western sea. It was the end of the road. They'd been pushed right to the edge of the continent, and there was simply no place else for them to go. Sings to Trees had hair the colour of sunlight and ashes, delicately pointed ears, and eyes the translucent green of new leaves. His shirt was off. He had the sort of tanned muscle acquired from years of healthy outdoor living, and you could have sharpened a sword on his cheekbones. He was saved from being a young maiden's fantasy, well, unless she was a very peculiar young maiden, by the fact that he was buried up to the shoulder in the unpleasant end of a heavily pregnant unicorn. Bits of unicorn dung, not noticeably more ethereal than horse dung, were sliding down his arm, and every time the mare had a contraction, he lost feeling in his hand. It had been nearly 2 hours, the ground was hard and cold, and his knees felt like live coals wrapped in ice. She'd kicked him twice, and if Sings to Trees hadn't known that it was impossible, he'd have begun to suspect that the unicorn had arranged a breech birth out of spite. No, he was being unfair. It couldn't be any more fun for her than it was for him. Just because he didn't really like unicorns, he shouldn't let it cloud his judgment. He sighed and tried yet again to get a grip on one of the foal's legs. Unicorn foals had hooves as delicate as glass bells, naturally, and however adorable they were when tripping lightly across the meadow, they were pure torture to grab in the slippery, less than hospitable environment inside the mother unicorn. If he could just get the little monster turned around, a few good pushes should do it. The problem was getting a good grip. He rode out another contraction with gritted teeth. Sings to Trees loved all living creatures with a broad, impartial love, the sort of love that rescues baby bats and stays up nights feeding them one drop of milk and mealworm mix at a time. He splinted the legs of injured deer and treated mites in the ears of foxes and gave charcoal to colicky wyverns. No beast was too ugly, too monstrous, too troublesome. He had once donned smoked glass goggles and shoulder-length cowhide gloves to sit up with an egg-bound cockatrice for 3 days, giving it calcium tablets and oiling its cloacal vents every 4 hours. Since he'd been nursing a pocketful of baby hummingbirds at the time, which had to be fed sugar water every 15 minutes, 16 hours out of the day, it had been quite an extraordinary 3 days. He still had nightmares about it. He'd never really warmed to unicorns. Possibly it was because they didn't need him. Regular elves loved unicorns as they loved all beautiful creatures, and a unicorn with so much as a stubbed hoof could turn up at the door of any elf in the world and be assured of royal treatment. Sings to Trees hardly ever had to deal with them, and he preferred it that way. But when somebody needed to actually reach a hand in there and turn a foal around, suddenly the unicorn lovers of the world melted away, and it was down to Sings to Trees and a barn and a bucket of soapy water. And the hind end of the unicorn, of course. As if to punctuate this thought, the unicorn kicked him again. He grunted. He was pretty sure the mare was smart enough to know that he was helping her. He just didn't think she cared. He got a grip on something that felt like a wee little hock and started the tricky process of hauling, coaxing, and generally begging the tiny creature to turn around. Another contraction came along, and he willed his numb fingers to hold on to the foal's leg. His fingers laughed at him. Give him trolls any day. 1,000 pounds of muscle and bone, froggish, goatish creatures the size of grizzly bears, with enormous curling horns that could smash through a concrete wall. They were ideal patients. Trolls might not be any more talkative than unicorns, but they understood every word you said, and if they had come to you for help, they'd trust you to the ends of the earth. You could saw off a troll's leg, and it would look at you with huge, tearful eyes the size of dinner plates, and hold still while you did it. And if you told them to come back in a week for a checkup, they'd be there a week later, as soon as the sun went down, squatting patiently in the vegetable patch, ready to be poked and prodded all over again. Singster trees quite liked trolls. And they were grateful too. Not a month went by when he didn't wake up to see gigantic cloven hoof prints around the yard and half a billy goat left draped across a tree stump. Not like unicorns. As soon as the foal was able to walk, the mare would be gone like a shot, and he'd never see her again. Come to think of it, maybe that wasn't a bad thing. "Okay," he said to the unicorn, mildly surprised at the weariness in his own voice. "I think I've got it presenting right. Let's give this a try. Push!" The mare pushed. He pulled. There was a brief, horrible moment where nothing happened, and Singster Trees saw another 2 hours of internal fumbling ahead of him, and then, with almost absurd ease, the foal slid out and hit him in the chest. The mare grunted in triumph, and he fell over backwards, with his arms full of slimy baby unicorn. Its first act was to kick him with its adorable little hooves. He gazed at the barn rafters while it beat at a 2 on his ribs. It hurt, but not as much as his knees did. Okay, not much more to go. He could handle this. He staggered upright, shuffled on his knees to the end of the unicorn he hadn't seen much of this evening, and dumped the foal in front of her. She bent down, snuffled at the tiny creature, tapped it delicately with her foot-long horn as if to test it, and then began licking at its damp white hide. The bedraggled foal lifted its muzzle and made a faint squeaky snort of protest. Even to someone who didn't much care for unicorns, at another time, this scene would be pure magic, a reaffirmation of everything good and noble in the world. But there was gunk from the hind end of a unicorn plastered clear up the side of his face, delicate hoof prints turning purple across his rib cage, and he felt about 1,000 years old. He got painfully to his feet. His knees had moved through the on-fire stage and now felt as if tiny wolverines were chewing under the kneecaps, and staggered outside to the pump. He tried to grab the pump handle, and for an awful minute his hand wouldn't close on it. Well, no surprise there. His right arm, which had been the one inside the unicorn, was red and white and bruising magnificently where contractions had smacked his bicep repeatedly against the mare's pelvic bones. And there was unicorn crap and amniotic fluid and bits of straw all over him. Singster Trees slumped against the pump handle, moaned, and managed to grab it with his left hand. By dropping most of his weight on it, with all the grace of a sack of potatoes, he got enough water out to sluice the worst of the muck from him. It was icy cold, but he didn't really care. There was soap somewhere. He found it. It didn't lather very well, but he made at least a symbolic effort before giving up. He ducked his head back in the barn and glanced over at the mother and child, who were arranged in a beautifully domestic scene as tranquil as the dawn. White hide glowed in the muted lamplight of the barn. You'd never know she'd spent hours in labour. That was unicorns for you. Pausing only to make sure that the afterbirth had passed with no difficulties, he considered patting the foal, but the mare, ingrate that she was, stamped a hoof at him and lowered her horn warningly. Sings to Trees limped out of the barn. The moon glared down like a bar of soap in a bucket of cold sky. The path up to the house was packed earth, washed blue and black in the moonlight, and approximately 1,000 miles long. Several ages of the earth passed while he toiled up to the house, punctuated by the bright jangle of pain from his knees. A coyote with one eye and a ragged ear was stretched out across the porch rug. When the elf was close enough, it lifted its head, pricked up the good ear, and came down to meet him. A cold nose touched his hand, and the tail made a careless motion that was certainly not a wag. Fleabane had a certain amount of dignity, despite his name, but might conceivably be mistaken for one. Sings to Trees wound a cold hand in the coarse hair behind the coyote's ears and rubbed affectionately. They walked the last few yards up to the house together, and then Fleabane flopped back down on the rug and Sings to Trees went inside. There were animals to be fed yet. A bat hanging upside down in the closet who was thankfully past needing ground mealworms shoved down its throat. An orphaned raccoon who was just starting on solid foods and needed warm milk with a little bread, and, of course, the gargoyle. He dumped a handful of dried mealworms on the closet floor, heard a grumpy chitter in response, and left the bat to its own devices. There was cold chicken left, and he divided it up carefully, 1/4 for a sandwich and 3/4 for the gargoyle. He built up the fire and set milk to warm by the hearth. The warmth was wonderful, if painful on his cold hands. He started to sink down into the rug in front of the fireplace, caught himself, and lurched to his feet. He didn't dare stop moving. If he sat down to rest, he wasn't going to get back up in a hurry. The back door opened with a wooden groan. He took 3 steps forward, turned, and chucked the battered remains of the chicken onto the roof. A stony chuckling came down to him, followed by the crunch of chicken bones. Satisfied, Sings to Trees went back inside to feed the raccoon. He must have made tea at some point, because when he woke up, there was a stone-cold mug of it next to his elbow and a half-eaten sandwich sliding off his knee. The raccoon cub was asleep on his lap, in the wreckage of what had been a saucer full of bread soaked in warm milk. Perhaps it was just as well he hadn't bothered with a shirt. It looked like most of the milk had gone into the raccoon anyway, and his sandwich had a distinctly gnawed look. Some days that was all you could ask for. Sings to Trees gave up even pretending he was awake. He put the raccoon to bed, towelled off the remnants of both their dinners as best he could, and limped to the bedroom. He had just enough energy to remove his shoes, and then sleep crept up and hit him. The 19th Infantry were marching, if you could call it that. Goblins march badly. They have enormous thick feet like elephants, so they are quite good at walking, but they have no rhythm, and very few goblins have ever mastered the ability to tell left from right without stopping to think about it. So when somebody yells, "Left foot, right foot," there is generally a long silence while the goblins all try to remember which is which. At some point, one bold goblin will step out, and all the others follow immediately in the hope he knows what he's doing. It's about a 50-50 shot if he's leading with the correct foot or not, but at least they're all wrong together. On a good day, they will stay in step for nearly a minute before somebody gets bored, or trips or stumbles or forgets what he's doing and begins skipping. Small knots break off. Officers ride around on their pigs, shouting orders and leaving havoc in their wake. Eventually, the better sergeants round up their units and herd them more or less in the direction that everybody seems to be going. In fits and starts, the goblin army lurches on. Nasilka was a fairly good sergeant and had most of the whining niners aimed in the correct direction. Algol and the pack mule formed the nucleus of the group, and since he was taller than most of the other goblins, everybody was able to keep him in sight. At the moment, Nasilka's greater concern was the two new recruits. They were identical twins, which gave her a headache, and they were young and bright-eyed and enthusiastic and finished each other's sentences, which took the headache to a whole new level. "Where are we going, Sarge?" "We don't know. We just follow orders and go there." They gave her identical nods. "Will we be fighting, Sarge?" "Sooner or later, yes." Everyone stumped along in silence for a while. The flat, stony badlands were giving way to little lumpy hills and the occasional scrubby tree with more trees on the horizon. The wind that came to them smelled like pine, which was a big improvement over goblin. The new recruits had the standard loincloth from home, made out of the standard rancid goat hide, and they both had what passed for weaponry in the goblin army, a board with a nail in it. Unless she managed to beat some kind of sense into them, Nasilka gave them a week. "So you're twins," she said, by way of an opening gambit. "Yes, Sarge," they said in unison. "How should I tell you apart?" "You don't! Not even our mum can tell us apart." "We'll fix that," she said grimly, and beckoned to Thumper. Thumper would need thick-soled boots to stand 4 feet tall, but he was at least 4 feet wide. His biceps were the size of badgers, and he had no neck. He did not use a shield, preferring to carry 2 large spiked maces, both taken from the fallen foe. Footnote: the goblin army could not afford maces. Recruits got a choice of big rock, board with a nail in it, and big rock on a stick. The better equipped goblins either had rich parents or had looted better weapons after a battle. When he was hitting things, there was a joyful gleam in his eye, and when he wasn't, there was a glitter that indicated he was probably thinking about hitting things. He had no personality that Nasilka had ever been able to uncover. Possibly it had gone off with his neck somewhere, but he was an excellent goblin to have at your side in a fight. "Recruits, this is Thumper." "Hi, Thumper," chorused the twins. Thumper treated this the way he treated everything that did not involve hitting things. He eyed it warily to see if there was any potential hitting to be had, and then ignored it. "Thumper," she said, "I can't tell these two apart." Thumper nodded. "Fix that," she said. He nodded again, turned around, and punched the one on the left in the face. The recruit fell over. The other recruit gaped at him. Thumper picked the damaged recruit up, nodded to the sergeant, and wandered off. The unfortunate goblin swayed on his feet. His left eye was already swelling and would shortly be turning a striking shade of purple. "That's better," said Nasilka. "Now then, the first thing you should learn is to never tell a superior officer what they can't do." They looked at her with identical miserable expressions, except for the swollen eye. "We're sorry, Sarge." "Yeah, well..." Nasilka squelched a nagging feeling of guilt. It was a hard world and a hard war, and the sooner they learned it, the better. "What are your names?" "Mishkin," said the one on the right. "Mushkin," said the one with the swollen eye. Right. The next thing you should learn is how to take a punch a little better than that, but it'll have to wait until we stop for the night. Have you had any training at all? We had 2 weeks of boot camp, Sarge. The sergeant grunted. Whacked a lot of straw men with your board, eh? Mishkin nodded vigorously. Mushkin nodded rather more gingerly, holding his face. Up ahead, Weatherby was drifting off to the side. Nasilka could tell he was planning to make a break for it because he was starting to mutter to himself and tug at his clothes. She sighed and did what sergeants have done since time immemorial. She delegated. Go see Corporal Algol and tell him that you've had the basic boot camp and nothing else. And that I said to put something on that eye. Yes, Sarge. The twins went to find Algol, and Nasilka went to collar Weatherby.
One of the many things I love about T. Kingfisher's writing is how delightfully disgusting she can be. If I found an eyeball in my gruel, you can bet that from then on I'd take every opportunity to inflict that story on the people around me. Especially if I wasn't quite sure whether the eyeball had belonged to an elephant or to one of my late co-workers. Another thing I love is that Kingfisher doesn't romanticize her characters or her critters, or any of the other details that she weaves into her worlds. Like the birth of a baby unicorn. In 9 Goblins, there's nothing magical about it. It involves a unicorn mare in a nasty mood and a great deal of unicorn, dung. Plus an exhausted veterinarian elf who spends hours with his arm up the unicorn mare's unpleasant end. Then the poor elf gets to drag himself home to feed the bat, the raccoon, and the gargoyle before falling fast asleep at the dinner table. There's a serious undertone to this story. The humans in 9 Goblins have done to the goblins what the humans have been doing to the wild things in many parts of our world, taking over their homes until there was no place else for them to go. In Kingfisher's world, the goblins have decided to fight back, and the elves have somehow gotten involved. We at Cast of Wonders have divided 9 Goblins into 9 parts, 1 part per goblin, and 1 part per episode. You've just heard part 1, so we have 8 more parts and 8 more episodes to find out what happens in the great war between the goblins, the humans, and the elves. No matter how things turn out, though, I suspect there's going to be a lot of funny stuff along the way. So join us again soon. We love bringing you the best audio fiction week after week, but we can't do it without your support. Your donations pay our authors, our narrators, our servers, and our staff. Please consider supporting us with a monthly donation through either PayPal or Patreon. You can also review us on Apple Podcasts, request us on Spotify, and consider the stories we publish for award consideration. There are lots of ways you can help. Join the discussion on the EA Forum, forum.escapeartists.net, or on EA Discord, or visit us on the platform formerly known as Twitter, @Cast of Wonders. Come say hello. Cast of Wonders is brought to you by editor Catherine Inskip, assistant editor Alicia Caparasso, associate editors Tanya Adelit, Amy Brennan, Joyce Hernandez, Somto Hiheswe, Kup Hakob, Amanda Kong, Ray O, Simon Pan, Samuel Poots, Emma Smales, Denise Sudell and Rin Yi, editorial assistant Amy Brennan, community manager Denise Sudell, and our audio producer Jeremy Carter. Cast of Wonders is part of the Escape Artists Foundation, a 501c3 nonprofit. And this episode is distributed under the Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, no derivatives, 4.0 international license. That means you can download or listen to the episode on any device you like, but you can't change it and you can't sell it. Our theme music is Appeal to Heavens by Alexei Nov, available from Promo DJ or his Facebook page. Thank you for listening.